Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jeff. This is Not Just Book Reviews. And on this episode, I want to talk about the Alan Moore, Dave Gibbons graphic novel, Watchmen. So I read Watchmen a few years after it was published in novel form. I was living out in California at the time. I was working at a Tower Records on Sunset Boulevard. RIP Tower Records. They are no more. And in the record store, there was a kind of metal spinny stand that had comics in it, kind of similar to a lot of stores. Even when I was growing up, when you went into stationery stores, they had comics on the little spindle stands. And I picked up Watchmen and Year One and The Dark Knight Returns, I think the same day. Bought them, took them home, and oh my God, what did I just discover? Now, I didn't read comics as a kid, so I didn't come to comics really until I read, the pinnacle of superhero comics in a row. So I don't really have a grounding in the history of comics, Golden Age, Silver Age. For that, you go to Michael K. Vaughan's channel because he's got the gem. Or I think Steve Donahue too also does a lot of comic stuff. But I grew up on sci-fi and fantasy novels, so not much in the way of comics. So I was spoiled in that, not reading comics and then reading Watchmen and the two Batman graphic novels as an adult kind of ruined me. Because I've tried to go back. I've read a lot of graphic novels since then, but it's so hard to read the average comic after these were my start. So I've never really gelled to comics as a form. They've not landed with me much. I found some interesting comics. V for Vendetta, I love. From Hell is fantastic. There's a couple of Superman titles that I like. Batman is always hit or miss. People do Batman, not so great. Ed Brubaker does a good Batman. And I haven't ventured too far out of superheroes. There's one called Louis Riel, which is about a famous Canadian pioneer who dealt with persecution and a comic biography, I think it's called, Louis Riel. I'll link it in the description box. It's incredible. And then there's a guy called Guy Delisle who does sort of travel comics about living in Jerusalem and living in I think in the East. He lived in China for a while. So I'm not that deep a comic reader, but Watchmen is probably my top 10 books of all time. Because even with a little bit of a smattering of the superhero genre, it's just kind of all you need to really get into Watchmen. You don't have to be a comic junkie to have all the themes of Watchmen come through. You just kind of need to know, like, what are the main superhero tropes? How are superhero comics thrown down? You could read maybe a dozen superhero comics of widely disparaging heroes. You'd be fine. So why, to me, is Watchmen like the greatest thing ever written in comic form? And here's what it's not. It's not because the plot is so novel. If you look at the plot, it's basically, okay, there's an evil villain masquerading as a good guy, trying to do something for the greater good, not take over the world, but do have this incredible plot that's going to kill a lot of people. We've seen that everywhere else, right? The individual heroes that they created, which I think they took heroes from an earlier comic. I mean, I don't know the lore of Watchmen. You could do a whole show on the making of Watchmen, which it's not my jam. But the heroes in Watchmen, okay, so Dr. Manhattan is kind of like Superman. Rorschach is kind of like Batman. Or the Punisher. The Owl is like Batman, kind of. And so, like, the powers and the heroes themselves, you've seen it other places. But to me, it's the slavish devotion to character that makes this book special, and the intertext that's used to pad out the world. So, when you do deep background, a lot of times when you do background and character in any kind of storytelling, whether it's graphic novels or a novel, they do it to kind of like, well, this is kind of who the character is growing up and what he kind of came through. But really, are there touch points in that character's life that directly play into the story that's happening as you're reading? It's usually like, all right, we're doing backstory for a character. But in Watchmen, all of the characters' backstories directly relate to the story and what prompted the story and what makes the story go. It's phenomenal. So you're having this incredibly vital reading experience because the character backstories are revealing so much about the world. It's like world building done through character, storytelling done through character. Everything is done through character. And then on top of it is the novel way that the story is told besides and around the characters. So you put those two together. And to me, Moore is a guy who grew up reading a lot of stuff. Like as a guy in my early 50s, whenever I dip into comics and read some stuff, to my mind, 90% of the comics that I try to read, to me, feel like they're written by people who grew up reading comics and going to the movies. But when you read Alan Moore comics, you're like, this is a guy who's read the pulps, he's read philosophy, he's read, he's read occult esoterica. He has a deep background in books. Like Alan Moore is literate, and he reads novels, and he reads nonfiction books, and he reads all kinds of wonderful things. He created the League of the Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is a knockoff kind of on Philip Jose Farmer's Wold Newton universe. But that means he's read all that stuff, you know what I mean? So when you read a Moore comic, even to me, head and shoulders above Frank Miller. When you read Frank Miller, Frank Miller's doing a noir knockoff, right? You don't know whether it's movies noir or books, and they're okay. It's okay. Like Miller's not the deepest writer in the world. He's amazing in what he does, but when you read Moore, you feel like you're in the hands of someone who knows more than you do about a lot of things. And it just feels like you're reading a novelist in a way. So I think that sets it apart from so many other graphic representations, in my opinion. I mean, and again, you could probably come up with 1,000 examples to the contrary, but and I've sampled a lot. I haven't done a lot of comprehensive read-throughs, but I've sampled a decent amount of comics. And that's kind of my conclusion. So I thought I would go over the characters and how they work in Watchmen by actually using the source material itself. Why not? It's a beautiful graphic novel. Why not use the graphics, right? So earlier as I spoke, there are 5 main character lenses that Watchmen uses to kind of tell the biggest chunks of the story. And those are the comedian, Rorschach, Dr. Manhattan, Adrian Veidt / Ozymandias, and Hollis Mason. Now, 4 of those characters are done in graphic sequential art format, and the 5th is done via text. So the first character we really get in depth with is Hollis Mason. And Hollis Mason was in the previous iteration of Watchmen called the Minutemen. And so what we're getting here, as you can see, is the text of his autobiography called Under the Hood. And if you continue on, you can see that this is full text. So when you're reading this in between the graphic sequential art, here it is. And like any kind of autobiography, right, you're getting pictures of him. This is his father. I think this is him as a kid, graduating from the police academy, right? So you're getting a real biography. And again, in this biography, you're kind of getting the genesis of masked costume heroes in the United States. But you're also getting a kind of window into why someone would do it. Why would someone kind of do this? So this is great background to Watchmen because there already was a group. This was one of the members, and you're getting this wonderful insight about how and why someone would do this through text. And these chapters are interspersed throughout. So you get 2 or 3 chapters here. Then you get more story told. Then you get 2 or 3 chapters that happen later on. And so there's this wonderful subtext that comes to life because of it. And it's pretty terrific. And the comedian is a fascinating character because the comedian is kind of, the author's lens on which they are looking through the superhero genre. I feel like comedian is kind of Alan Moore taking a look at all the tropes of the superhero genre because the comedian is someone who really is poking everybody in the eye, saying, "Hey, you think you're solving problems? You think you rustle down Moloch and put him away. You think you're changing things. In a few years, nukes are going to be flying because this takes place in a reimagined 1980s where Nixon is still president. We won Vietnam, so he is the lens on which the book is looking at superhero tropes very critically." So, and he's a really complicated character. So the brilliance of how we're introduced to the comedian is all in this chapter. So this chapter, as you can see, is called About Absent Friends. It takes place at his funeral. So you can see here that you have Adrian Veidt here, you have Dr. Manhattan, and you have Daniel Drieberg, who's the Night Owl, right? And so they've been invited to his funeral, and we're going to take a look at the character of the comedian through their eyes and then through the eyes of someone he used to work with. So if we go, before we get to them, Laurie, who's Silk Spectre, has flown to California to visit with her mom, and her mom had an encounter with the comedian years ago. So we're cutting back and forth, and we can see that they're having a conversation, and all of a sudden, she's looking at an old picture of the Minutemen, which is, comedian was the only person, I think, who was a member of both. So she goes ahead and she's looking at this photograph, and boom, we get this thing, and now we're back in time, right? So now we are back in the days of the Minutemen. And so we get our first flashback of Eddie Blake, who's the comedian, and the first thing we see of him is he's a rapist. I mean, look at some of these panels are really brutal. She scratches him and says no, and he's pounding her and about to rape her when Hooded Justice comes in and stops it. So that's our first lens on who Eddie Blake is, and we think, wow, this is incredible. Then the second lens, you can see here, we're back at the funeral, and here's Adrian Veidt, and we've got these wonderful panels as we zoom in on him, now remembering the comedian. This was an early iteration of Watchmen. It had an extra person in it, Nelson Gardner, I think is Captain Metropolis. So there's an interaction that happens here, and we get to hear a little more about Blake. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where he's saying here, especially in this this part right here, where he's like, hey, look, this is what's going to be happening to the country. You guys don't know anything, right? And so you see wonderfully here that Adrian Veidt, like, it struck him what the comedian did. It was really kind of amazing, and he remembers it. So then we back out again, and now Jonathan Osterman we see here at the bottom. Now we're in Vietnam. And again, we're being told the backstory of the whole world through this character. So we're in Vietnam. It's over because we find out that John helped the Americans win the war. And we see another aspect of his character. But also their interactions shows a little something about John's character, because he does have the gift of this truthful insight that he uses a lot, which makes him a very interesting character. And then we see how he got his scar with this interaction with this woman who he was with, and really intense scene right here. So we have that. Now we're back out at the funeral. Then here's Dan Drieberg, the third one. His memories when there were riots. The police went on strike because they didn't, they felt that the heroes were doing their job, and so on and so forth. So there's this whole thing about what he was talking about during the strike, and there's some wonderful, wonderful text here. That's basically how the comedian story is told, through these wonderful flashbacks. So not only are you getting the depth of his character, you're getting how the world existed and a little bit of the history of Watchmen during it. So it's vital storytelling. You're in every second of this because you're learning so much about everything. So the next character, we get a full chapter on the origins of Dr. Manhattan. His name is Jonathan Osterman, and the brilliant thing about how this is told is because Dr. Manhattan is a character who experiences time in a nonlinear fashion. Moore and Gibbons try to do a nonlinear take on his story. So here in this panel, for instance, you see it is 1985. I'm on Mars. I'm 56. Then later on, it's August 7th, 1945. The Brooklyn morning is humid. He's back experiencing that moment with his dad, right? And here, 40 years ago, cogs rain on Brooklyn. 115 minutes into the future, the meteorites fall on Mars. Now it's 1948, and he's at Princeton. So this whole chapter of him is told out of time in this wonderful way of, like, I'm here, I'm there, I'm in the past, I'm in the future. And it's a brilliant way. Again, we're seeing the genesis of the most powerful godlike character in the book. But how this character experiences time is done via storytelling. You're seeing it done the way things are laid out and the way Moore and Gibbon had worked it out, which is incredible. I mean, this is not your average storytelling. This is, there's the story. Again, this is one of these things about Watchmen, right? The origin story for Dr. Jonathan Osterman is like, yeah, he went into some chamber, something happened, and he came out a superpower. Like, how many times have we seen that throughout comic history? It's not that special. But what is special is the way it's told, number one. Number two, the depth of the writing. There's a beautiful vulnerability in the writing. It's not tough guy comic book writing. It's not trying to be funny. It's not trying to be cool. It's actually very beautiful writing. It's very vulnerable, honest writing, and it's told in this incredible, unique way. So it's just, these are why this book is so incredibly special, and not like its brethren. So now we come to Rorschach, and Rorschach is a wonderful character. So first of all, the metaphor for Rorschach, here's a character who takes his name from this famous ink blot test, where someone puts a blob of ink between two pieces of folded paper, folds it, opens it up again, and whatever shape that ensues, now there's a deck made out of these shapes. And so it used to be where you sat in a psychiatrist's office, and they would hold up the ink blots, and they would say, what does this make you think of? And you would say. And of course, the trick to this is that they are really nothing. But what you decide they are, and the shapes that they suggest to you about what they are, the idea was that this would help the therapist kind of get into your subconscious a little bit and maybe get a handle on some things in your emotional life. But I think the metaphor for his character here is that, Rorschach is the one character who he recognizes that, if maybe like some of the other heroes, that there is a good and there is a bad, that things do have a shape and there is a meaning to the world, where Rorschach comes to it and he's like, eventually something happens to him and he recognizes for himself that there is no meaning, that the world is what we make of it. There is nothing else, right? And it's an incredibly compelling character. He's also kind of like a right-wing Nazi in a lot of ways. I have a girl I was seeing at the time started to read Watchmen. And early on, the noir bit of Rorschach, where it's Rorschach's journal, 1985, blah, 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 blah. She started reading and she's like, oh, God, this is terrible. And I was like, yeah, but it's kind of, that's who this character is, and there's more to it than that. And, she didn't get past it. But, yeah, he's not super likable, just like a comedian. There's a lot about the comedian that he's kind of a villain in a way, the one hero villain. But he's able to kind of speak truths that no one else can see. And Rorschach is kind of a right-wing Nazi, and he's very black and white in a sense, which makes him an interesting character. He's not, a glossy superhero. The Rorschach chapters, like the comedian being dealt with at a funeral through the lens of four characters, Jonathan Osterman being dealt with via an out of time, Hollis Mason being dealt with via text, Rorschach is dealt with in two very interesting ways. The main chapter where we get to know him is actually done like a Rorschach ink blot test. And I'm going to throw up one panel right here. So the way the chapter is told is when Malcolm Long, his psychiatrist, he shows him the ink blot tests. Rorschach looks at him and tells him that he sees a very positive image. But in reality, then, what we see as the reader is the dark thing that he really sees, that the ink blot really reminds him of. And this is a brilliant way to walk through a chapter. You're using his character's name and what it means and stands for as a structure and a lens to actually structure the chapter. So this is the first way that Rorschach's story is told. One of the famous things about Watchmen is one of the chapters and how it is constructed, and it has a lot to do with Rorschach, and it has a lot to do with this notion of the both sides being in relationship. So in the chapter called Fearful Symmetry, the way that Moore and Gibbons set it up is the very first panel is a kind of thematic mirror to the very last panel. And this is a wonderful website, by the way. I'll link it in the description box on a website called Medium. But they go frame by frame through the whole chapter. So this, for example, here's a perfect example here. This on the left is the first panel of the entire chapter. This one on the right is the last panel. You can see, obviously, that they match and they kind of mirror each other. Now, this is the second panel of the chapter, and this is the second to last panel. And here, the commentary by the writers here, that this is kind of a perfect symmetry. Rorschach is walking purposely towards something, and here he's being dragged away. The colors are the same. Again, here's another pair of panels where they're both about violence. And again, we're working backwards from the front and from the rear. Color symmetries here. Um, color symmetries as well. Again, color, right? And these are separated by a lot of other text. So the whole chapter is done this way. And you don't really know. I mean, this is one of these things that, like, if it was there or not there, it wouldn't have anything to do with the book. But the kind of way that the book is layered is that there are these things in there. Like the writers put this kind of stuff in there, and it's incredible. The next character is Adrian Veidt, Ozymandias, and he turns out to be the villain of the story, but he's been one of the costumed adventurers for years. And his story is told pretty straightforwardly. It's kind of an Alexander the Great analog, but his name comes from a very famous poem from Percy Shelley called Ozymandias. And, the poem itself is very brief, but the end of it is sort of about these folks coming upon the desert. And there's basically this huge cracked statue there, and they're wondering that at some point, this person was a ruler over this vast land, and all that's left now is kind of this desert and a cracked head. And it's kind of the meta for Ozymandias, like, he's going to do all this stuff where he thinks he's going to save the world. What is he really going to create? What is his legacy going to be? Maybe not what he thinks it is. So I love that the name of the character harkens back to this poem that's kind of metaphorically related to what he's going to do in the story, and what his journey is, as well as another part of it. So it's pretty much straightforward with Veidt. So now I want to talk about the other part of this, where the intertext, these are the things that are put in between the graphic portions of the book. And Hollis Mason was the first one I talked about. The second one is this sort of think tank report, Dr. Manhattan, Superpowers, and the Superpowers. And it comes right after a chapter that's involving him. So you're getting a little context about what the rest of the world thought of him when he arrived, right? So here it is, just a full kind of think tank, Rand Corporation essay about his impact on the world. Now, another wonderful part of this book is the Tales of the Black Freighter, which is a kind of horror pirate story that's done in between all the other stories. And as you can see here, there's a news vendor and a guy who's just there reading the comics for free, and he's reading something called Tales of the Black Freighter. And so you're getting this real story. You can see the little curled pages. This is from the comic Tales of the Black Freighter. And this is a meta commentary on Adrian Veidt and his journey to what he thinks is going to be savior of the world, except what is really going to happen to him. And it's brilliant. And you can see, too, here, again, it's cutting back and forth between the conversation, and then here's a panel of the actual pirate. And the story goes, flips back and forth. And it's an amazing intertext. And, when I think there was an animated Tales of the Black Freighter released as kind of a special edition of the Watchmen movie, I thought, there's how much do you not understand what this story is? And that if you don't have it threaded in between the story, it doesn't make any sense, and it's not important. It's just, it's kind of a misunderstanding, again, of the source material. In line with Tales of the Black Freighter, now you're getting sort of like a fan zine story about the comics that Tales of the Black Freighter was part of. And they talk about EC Comics, which was a real comic line. And they kind of make believe that Tales of the Black Freighter was one of the EC lines, right? And here you go. I mean, look at this photo down here. Here's the guy who created it. You're getting a sense of what the comics were like. So they're giving you like critical commentary on the type of comics that it came from. Even little clips from Tales of the Black Freighter itself, right? Just amazing, amazing intertextuality here. When Rorschach is captured, you're now getting the intertext of the arrest report and the files that the psychologist is looking at. And they're very detailed, as you can see. The detail of the arrest is here. Next couple of pages is a psychiatric report, a preliminary summary of where he used to be. The home where he came from, and a little picture of him when he was younger, right? So again, more backstory and little addendums to his personality. A little sketch that he drew when he was a kid. Like, this is such Alan Moore's obsessiveness, really used to wonderful effect. Now you're getting a little bit about Dan Drieberg, who we don't get too much of Dan and Laurie in this because they're kind of the present day characters who are carrying the story. We don't get too much backstory with them, but we do get an essay written by Dan about owls and the mythological connections. And here it is, wonderful drawings. Just a full-on essay that you might find in kind of a nature magazine of sorts, right? Wonderful, just wonderful edition. And now we also get an issue of the New Frontiersman, which is kind of like a right-wing, Republican publication, but it's very much in favor of Rorschach and the costume heroes. We get the whole issue. The main story is about the costume heroes, obviously, and there's like a political cartoon here about the way this magazine thinks about everyone else in the world, and it's wonderful, wonderful. And it looks like it's still being, done. It's still in galleys. There's a razor blade here, the photo to come here, right? It's wonderful. And then we have this wonderful thing, missing writer, right? And that plays into the plot of the story because one of the writers of the comics, Max Shea, I think, who wrote the pirate comic, disappears. We don't know why, and there's a little tag here again, just rounding it out. Rounding it out. Here, then, we have a bit on Sally Jupiter, and she's interviewed, but it's also kind of her scrapbook, so we get a little bit about her backstory, about what her life was like, and some letters that were written to her by fans, and here's a picture of her with Laurie when Laurie was young, and reviews when she went into film, right? Wonderful. Then a brief interview at the end. Then here we get some Adrian Veidt's business memoranda to get a sense of what it was like him running this company. The toy line that he came up with, right, based on the Watchmen characters, which is just really cool. And nostalgia is the perfume that is threaded through this entire book in all kinds of Easter eggs. Then another brief interview with him here. Doug Roth, again, a writer for, I think, the New Republic or the New Frontiersman. Right, so there's the connection there. Journeys to Antarctica to interview him, and now that near the end of the book, when we're getting the reveal of who he really is and what he did, now it's contextualized. It makes sense. So this is wonderful. So a lot of the interview, as he's we're getting more of him. We're getting more of a sense of a fully rounded character he is. So now I just kind of also wanted to show you some of the style of Watchmen in terms of the writing. And one of the things that Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons do that I've rarely seen done in other comics, I'm sure there are, but they do it repeatedly and they do it very well. And this is to use dialogue from one scene and overlap it onto another scene. So you can see here in this panel on the right that the cops investigating are getting into an elevator. And all throughout this story, we're seeing what they think may have happened and actually what did happen, intertexted, right? So, like, in this scene, they're talking about, like, what do you think happened, blah, 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 blah. Somebody really had it in for this guy, and look, there's Blake getting his butt kicked. But here, these guys are saying, hey, what floor do you want on the elevator? Ground floor, please. And then the next thing is ground floor coming up, but the picture is of Blake being thrown out a window. Ground floor coming up, right? Extremely ironic. This is done throughout the book to wonderful effect. This is also done when Laurie and Dan have gone out to dinner and they're walking, and Dr. Manhattan is being interviewed on a talk show. So there's a whole fight that they go through. And Moore writes it using dialogue from the interview to comment on the fight. Right here we have in this panel, and believe me, we have something really special for you tonight. And we're seeing a gang of knife-wielding thugs surrounding our two heroes, right? So as we go forward, they ask him about, Afghanistan and Russia, and will you be prepared to enter into hostilities? And there our other two heroes are about to enter into hostilities, right? Let's try to keep it snappy is another line. I believe it was quite sudden and quite painful. It's all these wonderful lines as they're having this fight. Am I starting to make you feel uncomfortable? They're asking Manhattan, and Laurie is grabbing some guy by the balls. So amazing way that this is done from panel to panel. It has a wonderful style all its own, and they're very sharp and funny in each instance. not only do you have these wonderful character stories told, the big five, then those, and how it reveals the story and how interesting these characters are. Very interesting story. And how serious they take it and how they're kind of turning the superhero idea on its head. That's amazing. You have this intertextuality. You have a guy like Alan Moore who's writing from a place of having read beyond and above comics, now bringing that to the comic book world. Then the style is very straightforward in a sense. So they don't, there's all this incredible creative stuff going on, but as it's presented, you mostly have 9 panel pages. Every once in a while, things don't get crazy. It's not like Batman Arkham Asylum, where the book itself is kind of nuts. The book itself tells the story pretty straightforward. So all this other creative stuff can happen, and kind of the way it's told gets out of the way because it's very straightforward. But Moore's detail, and I say Moore's detail because I'm going to flash this page up. The page you're looking at now is from Alan Moore's script of Watchmen, and it's describing one panel, right? One bloody panel. You don't get that in comics these days. I mean, these days, comics, you get kind of, especially superhero comics, you kind of get the main character, maybe 1 or 2 things in the background, and you're moving on. The amount of detail and little things in you can go cherry pick. This probably is a Watchmen companion. Because in every frame, every once in a while I would see things too, like specifically titles of movies or books in the background, or other things where I was like, oh man, this is something. I'm not sure what this is, but this is something. The incredible hyper detail that they put into every panel. Again, it lends to deepen the book, and it makes the experience incredibly rich and rewarding. One of the problems after Watchmen was written is that DC looks at Watchmen as an intellectual property, much like everything else that they own. And there's been knockoffs of Watchmen, interpretations of Watchmen. They did a comic series years ago called Before Watchmen, which purports to be a story of the Minutemen, which was the group that preceded the Watchmen, that Hollis Mason and Sally Jupiter were part of. I dipped in a few comics. Frankly, I was a little embarrassed that these writers would even agree to do such a thing. I felt like the hubris to these comic book artists and writers that they're going to do Before Watchmen. I was like, how did you? It's like I'm going to write it's like I'm going to write a sequel to Hamlet. Like, yeah, that's what I'm going to do, just to sell a few books. So, I was really kind of disappointed in it, and I dipped in a few things, and it was barely readable. So I didn't even bother. I thought, you're peeing on the Mona Lisa here. What are you doing? Zack Snyder's film, I thought, was woefully misguided. I respect the fact that I think he loves the source material as much as I do, but instead of taking what makes Watchmen really special and bringing it to the screen, he just took he used the comic book, I think, as the whatever those cards are to map out your movie, and he basically filmed the graphic novel, and in doing so, destroyed it. To me, it's such a flat, dead film. And I'm going to link below. I did a podcast. I went through Watchmen, the film, scene by scene, to kind of talk more in depth about what I don't like about it and what I think he shouldn't have done. So I'll link that in the description box to my podcast. But I thought it was terrible. However, the latest adaptation done by Damon Lindelof was pretty good, because he took what makes Watchmen, I think, special, and he made it his own. Like, he didn't try to do the comic book. He didn't try to repeat what Moore and Gibbons had done. He discovered something else. He wanted to merge it with, Black history in this country, and he discovered this incredible thing that happened in Oklahoma, and so he made this whole brand new thing out of it using the characters. And I thought it was flawed. To me, it was some of the best TV I've seen in a long time for the first half or 2/3 of it, and then I thought it kind of fell apart. The ending kind of was very by the numbers. I didn't think it lived up to the first 2/3 of it, which were amazing. And I thought if Alan Moore watched that, I thought he notoriously doesn't make a dime from it. He hates it. Doesn't want anything to do with DC. They're trying to give him money. He's like, go to hell. But I feel like if somebody like Moore watched the Damon Lindelof Watchmen, he would have to grudgingly be like, okay. He took what I did, but he took the spirit of what I did, and he went beyond the comic world into history and real things that happened, and he brought that in, and he made it literary, and he made it about something. And I thought that was impressive. Again, I thought it kind of fell apart in the latter stages, but well done, Damon Lindelof. So anyway, that's about all I have to say about Watchmen. Again, it's one of my top 10 books. That includes prose. I think it's a masterpiece of art in any form, whether it's novels or comics. It's a one-of-a-kind thing. I don't think it'll ever be equaled or surpassed. It's really a special book for me as well. So thanks for watching.